Today is a exciting day. You heard Bertie say that, and God is doing some great things in and through Church Story, and I believe today is going to be one of those providential days for us. When my boys were significantly younger, I think Cam was probably two and a half, maybe. Braden was 3, 4 years old. There was a day we were in the living room, and it was Daddy Day. Those were the days that we got stuck at home without the supervision of Brandy to make sure that everything was taking place the way it was supposed to. And I looked over, and Cam was kind of messing with one of the electrical sockets on the wall. And I said, "Hey, Cam, I need you to leave that alone." And in true Cam fashion, he responded and said, "Why?" And so I did what my dad always did with me, and what some of you that are maybe my age or older, your parents probably did this with you. When they told you to do something, you asked why, they would respond with, "Because I said so." And that worked for me, I think, most of the time. My dad might argue that maybe that didn't work. My mom might think that wasn't the case. But with Cam, that didn't work because then Cam said, "But why, Dad?" And I was like, "Well, because it's really dangerous, and it'd be better if you just didn't mess with it. So just trust me, all right? Just trust me." Why? I'm like, "Okay, son, listen." So I got down on the floor with him, got down on a knee and standing there with him. I said, "You see this little white box on the wall right here?" I said, "If you were to take something and stick that in one of those little slots, there's about 1,000,000 volts of electricity in there." I know that's an exaggeration, but I was trying to prove a point. Okay, so just follow me. I said, "There's about 1,000,000 volts of electricity in that little box right there. And if you stick something in that socket, that electricity is going to enter your body. And because your body is 75% made up of water, which is also a conductor of electricity, that electricity is going to shoot to your heart in a moment, in an instant, and your heart is going to explode and you're going to die. So don't touch the socket." You know how he responded? "Why?" I'm like, "Dude, I can't win with you." And it was really just a foreshadowing of life with Cam. Cam thinks, he speaks what he thinks. I love it because there's no secrets with Cam. But he wanted to know why. And I think we all want to know why. We don't want to just do something to do something. Simon Sinek wrote a book 10, 15 years ago called Know Your Why. And it was all about, if you're going to do something, then know why you do it. Don't set out to do something until you know clearly what is the reason why I am doing this. And I really want the rest of our time together today to kind of feel like that. I want it to feel like this is, we're trying to understand the why. The why behind what? Well, we've been talking about for several weeks that we're moving into the next chapter. And as a church, we are going to give above what we already give to go beyond where we currently are. And this is a significant day. This is a significant look ahead to what God is wanting to do, specifically as we think about a church home, a permanent structure that we can call a home for Church Story. Now, as Bertie said earlier, if you're here for the first time, or maybe you're still kind of kicking the tires on Church Story and all that Church Story could be for you and your family, please just take any pressure you might feel, any obligation. Nobody is watching you to make sure you participate in this. But for the rest of us that would call Church Story home, I think this is a day that God is leading us into something together. But I think it's important that we know the why. And for those that aren't super connected to Church Story, that's great. We're glad you're here. And I think you're going to learn something today about who we are and maybe what value that could be for you and for your family. But also on Tuesday night, a little plug here, there's a welcome dinner taking place at our home. It's Brandy's home that she lets the rest of us live in. And we would love for you to show up and be a part of that. If you've never been to a welcome dinner, it's an opportunity to find out about the vision and the mission of Church Story and how that can impact you, your family, and those around you. And so you get to hang out with some of our staff and some others that are new to Church Story. You can register for that on the app, or you can register on the Connect card that you found in your seat. But as we think about this, thinking about giving beyond what we give, or giving above what we give to go beyond where we currently are, I want us to look at Psalm chapter 50. And as you turn there, I was thinking about this. I've been in church almost my whole life. Since I can almost remember, I've been going to church. I had a drug problem as a young child. My parents drug me to church often. That's one of the lamest church jokes I think I've ever heard, but I just used it. But I've been in church almost my whole life, and I've heard pastor after pastor after pastor stand on a stage similar to this and say something like this: God doesn't need your money. And there's been many times I've heard a pastor say that, and I'd say in my head, that's right. He doesn't need my money. So why are you talking about my money? Why are you trying to lead me to give? Why are you trying to make me feel obligated to give to the church if God doesn't need my money? In Psalm 50, there's a verse that maybe you're familiar with and you've heard people quote before, where it talks about God having the cattle on 1,000 hills. And that's where we're going to pick up today. But in this passage, a little context, God is dialoguing with his people about their offerings, about their sacrifices, about what they're bringing back to God. And so look what it says in Psalm chapter 50, verse 8. This is God speaking. He says, I do not rebuke you for your sacrifices, and your burnt offerings are continually before me. So obviously, they are bringing offerings to God. And God is saying, listen, I'm not pushing those back. I'm not trying to discourage you from what you're doing. I just need you to understand the motive. I need you to understand the why behind why you're giving these offerings. Don't bring these to me because you think I need any of this. Continues on in verse 9. He says, I will not take a bull from your house, nor male goats from your folds. For every animal of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. Again, God's reminding them that I have everything already. Goes on in verse 11. I know every bird of the mountains and everything that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and everything it contains. So he's saying, listen, I'm not hungry. I'm not homeless. He's trying to make a point here that, and even if he was hungry, he's telling us he wouldn't tell us because why? Because he has everything. He doesn't need us or anything that we have to meet a need in his life and in all that he's doing. He doesn't need our offerings. He doesn't need our sacrifices. He doesn't need our giving. He doesn't need our money. Okay, so we've always heard that. God's need ultimately is not our why. It's not the why for next chapter, which leaves us in a spot. Okay, if God doesn't need our money, then why are you talking to us over the last several weeks, Wes, about giving and pledging and committing financial resources to the next chapter? Well, I think we see two reasons here. The first one is this: your generosity accelerates the mission of God on earth. God doesn't need our money, but our money accelerates the mission of God that he's called us to on this earth. Do you remember the last thing Jesus said to his followers before he ascended into heaven? Matthew 28, verse 18 tells us, it says, and Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go therefore, it's an important word I almost left out, go therefore, and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to follow all that I commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. The last command of Jesus was to go. Go. There's movements. Go where? Go to every person on the planet and introduce them to this Jesus. Introduce them to the good news of Jesus, the good news of the gospel. That is the most essential and most critical mission on the earth today. It has been since Jesus said this to his disciples, and it continues to be today. The reality of that is that it takes resources, and it can be expensive, especially in our culture today. And so it requires that we lean in with our resources to the mission of God. Romans 10, Paul speaks into this mission, and he says in Romans chapter 10, verse 8, he says, but what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we are preaching. The good news here is that you and I can go from death to life spiritually. That's what Paul is laying out. That we can be saved from the crash course of death that is our only hope left on our own. Apart from Christ, that's best case scenario, is death, is eternal separation from God. But he's saying there's good news. You can actually, there's an alternative. There is another way. This is the good news of the gospel. How is this possible? Well, he says in verse 9, he says that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So how are we saved? Well, Paul just told us, confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, specifically to you. Confess that Jesus is Lord of your life. Jesus, I lay my own life down, my dreams, my treasures, everything that I am, because I trust you. I confess you as Lord, but not just confess you as Lord. I believe in my heart that God raised you from the dead. That is where salvation is found. It's a confession of faith that Paul is laying out. You and I are saved by confessing Jesus as Lord and believing in our hearts that God raised him from the dead. Goes on in verse 10. For with the heart a person believes, resulting in righteousness, and with the mouth he confesses, resulting in salvation. That's what we just talked about. For the scripture says, whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, abounding in riches for all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Like, come on, Church Story. This is good news. This is exciting news. And I think sometimes we get into our church setting like we are today, and we just completely skim past this and fail to recognize the weight of the reality of the good news of Jesus. This is worth celebrating. Some of you are going to go listen to Scott Stapp sing at the rodeo in a couple weeks, listen to Creed, and you're going to celebrate and lose your mind as his hair just kind of flows in the wind. And yet we'll sit here and talk about new life in Christ, that there's an alternative to the reality of eternal separation. And we're kind of like, this is worth celebrating today. But this is also why we're here. This is the mission of the church. This is the foundation of everything that we do. It says that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. This is the mission. This is the mission for Church Story. This is what Jesus left us to do. Every person who calls on the name of the Lord, regardless of where they come from, what they've done, what they believed before they made that confession, every person who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. This is significant. He goes on, though. In verse 14, he says, how? This is what we're talking about today. How, then, are they to call on him in whom they have not believed? How are they to believe in him who they have not heard? And how are they to hear without a preacher? But how are they to preach unless they are sent? Just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news of good things. This is what next chapter is all about. This is what we're rallying around in this season for our church. A group of ordinary people stepping into an extraordinary purpose that we believe God is leading us into, that he's continuing to lead us with our lives. This is the sending part of all of this, the sending part of the equation. We know the mission is to preach the gospel in the whole world. This is the most essential enterprise on planet Earth today, to go and preach the good news of Jesus. But how can people be saved if someone isn't sent? How can someone be sent if they haven't been spent, if time hasn't been spent in preparing them to be sent? And all of this takes resources. And if there's no resources to send them, then no one is ever sent. One of the things we've done since we started Church Story a few years ago is we have a weekend in the spring that we call Free T-Shirt Weekend. And what we do is everybody that shows up on that particular Sunday gets a free T-shirt. And so those of you who have been around a little bit more than a year, you remember that. And that day is coming. We are doing it again in 2026. It's going to happen a little bit later than normal. We're going to do it post-Easter instead of before Easter. But that's a weekend where you show up, you get a free T-shirt. And I think that comes from a place, I spent a lot of time as a youth pastor in my day. That was what I wanted to do for a long time, and I was able to be a part of some really incredible youth ministries. And one of the things I learned about teenagers is they love free T-shirts. They love T-shirts. But if it's a free T-shirt, they're all in. Like, they're bringing their friends. Everybody's showing up for a free T-shirt. What I've learned in my role as a pastor is that we don't ever outgrow our love for free T-shirts. Even as adults, we love a free T-shirt. I mean, people lose their minds when they find out it's free T-shirt weekend and they're not going to be here that weekend. Because if you don't show up that weekend, you don't get a free T-shirt. You can pay for whatever's left over the next weekend, but you don't. And people lose their minds. Like, I want a free T-shirt. I'm like, well, you better show up to church then, because we love a free T-shirt. But here's why we do that. Because church marketing is a little bit of a unique thing, because you don't read about social media campaigns in the book of Acts when the church was exploding. You don't read about billboards. You don't read about mailers being sent to people's post office boxes. You don't read about those things. And so it's like, what's the model? What's the strategy for marketing? I don't know. I don't know if there is one, except to just go and share and introduce people to the good news of Jesus. But T-shirts start a conversation. And over the years, I've heard story after story after story of people like you who have been in places around our community where somebody asked about the T-shirt you had on. And they're like, what does your T-shirt mean? I heard a story last year about this time when we did free T-shirt weekend. Someone was in HEB, and the cashier finally asked this lady, she said, hey, what does your shirt mean? Because I've seen 3 other people come through today with that same shirt on. She said, oh, this is my church. It's church story. Started telling her a little bit about it, invited her. I don't know if that particular cashier ever showed up to church story. I don't know. But I know there's been countless conversations because of a t-shirt in a school hallway, down the street, in the workplace. It's a conversation starter. And I know that there are people who have showed up to Church Story and have gotten plugged in at Church Story because of a conversation that started around a t-shirt that led to a conversation about the good news of Jesus. But here's the thing about the t-shirt. It wasn't actually free. It's not like we have some t-shirt company that subsidizes our t-shirts for us at Church Story. They come at a cost. So thank you, Church Story, for investing in free t-shirts that lead to conversations that might actually have an eternal impact on someone's life. It takes resources. But it's something that we do. It's what we're called to. It's part of the mission of Church Story. Sometimes sending is sending a person in a t-shirt at Costco on a Sunday afternoon. Sometimes it's sending someone to just be a presence of goodness and God's love and God's grace on the street that they live in or in the cubicle that they work in 40 hours a week. It's all about sending, but sending on purpose with a mission. And so my prayer as I've been looking forward to today and looking really forward to the future and to the next chapter is that we would be a people that we begin to see and experience this mission and the life found in living in it. And that in that, we begin to raise the name of Jesus up in a way that the whole world begins to take notice. And my prayer isn't just that Church Story would be those people, but that every church on every corner in this community would come alive to who Jesus is and what he has called us to. And there would be a revival that breaks out in our city because it is the most essential thing that we've been tasked with as followers of Jesus. During the summer of 2024 in July, there was an assassination attempt on one of the presidential candidates. You remember this. What's fascinating is in the few days following the assassination attempt, donations towards that candidate's campaign were record-breaking. And it wasn't heavy hitters who had a lot of money to give that had this massive capacity financially. It was everyday, ordinary people contributing to this campaign. About a month later, the name on the ticket for the other political party changed. And in the days following that change of name on the ticket, there were record-breaking donations coming in for that party. Why? Because ordinary people like you and me believed that it was a critical time in the history of our nation, and they wanted to invest in that because they believed in the mission behind the political candidate that they were supporting. So my question for us today as we consider that is, what would it look like if we understood that the most critical mission that we're called to is to take the name of Jesus to the world around us? Can I propose that is there anything more important than bringing Jesus to our community, to our schools, to our workplaces, to our sports teams, to our living rooms? This is what we're called to. And so I've been praying that we would catch a vision of this, that we would catch an understanding of this, and we would live in it. Not just the heavy hitters with a significant capacity to give financially, but for the everyday, ordinary people like you and me. This is what we're called to. And in that, our hope, our prayer is that we would have a permanent church home in the near future. And so if you've been around for the last few weeks, or if you haven't been around for the last few weeks, let me catch you up briefly. There's information for this you can pick up on your way out. There's folders called that say next chapter. They've got booklets, all the information about our permanent home that we're working towards. And over the last several weeks, I've been communicating to you that we're stepping into a 3-year focus where we're hoping to raise $7 million that will go towards the construction of a new church home and paying off the debt of what we currently owe on the property that we purchased this time last year. You remember last year we raised $1.3 million to put down on a 10-acre piece of property right down the street, across the street from two new Tomball school campuses next door to a new Tomball high school. And that's where we're going to be. That's going to be our home one day. But it comes with a significant cost. There's a lot of money involved and required for us to do this. And so we're inviting people to pray. We've been praying over the last 21 days that God would lead us and that we would respond obediently to what it is he's leading us to give towards this, above what we already give, to go beyond where we already are, to build a 33,000 square foot building on this 10 acres. That over the next several decades, we're building this for the generations to come. I talked about that in week 1. That every single year there's going to be over 5,000 students and staff within direct, close proximity to our church building. And so while we're building a space for us to gather and worship like this, we're also building a place where we can welcome people in, that we can leverage this space for the community around us so that we can help meet the needs of people, so that we can care for people that are in crisis, so that they can support educators as they serve the community in ways that most people don't even understand, so that we can be a place for our community, but also so we can worship together, because we can't stay here forever. Tomball ISD has been such an incredible partner for us. I'm so incredibly grateful for all that they have done to allow us to stay here. But kind of like some of those extended family members that you have, when you go stay at their house, there's a certain limit to that. And you're like, I got to get out of here. We got to go. Or it's not going to be healthy for anyone. That's kind of where we're at. It's time to step into the next chapter. And so I know that we've been praying, and there's going to be a moment for us to respond to that in just a few moments. But that's the point of this passage. This passage is leading us somewhere. This is what it looks like to commit, because the mission is the greatest mission of all. If you go back to Psalm 50, I love how it ends, because we've also often heard about the cattle on 1,000 hills, but when you really dig in to this passage from start to finish, it lands somewhere really, really rich for us. So if you go back to Psalm 50, look at verse 23. It says, he who offers a sacrifice. That word sacrifice continues to show up in this passage, in a lot of the passages that we've been reading. He offers a sacrifice of thanksgiving. It honors me. And to him who sets his way properly, I will show the salvation of God. God is speaking to his people, and he's saying not only does the sacrifice honor God, but the sacrifice prepares the way so that God will show the salvation of God. So not only do we think about our generosity in a way that it accelerates the mission of God on this earth, but your generosity, our generosity, writes us into a greater story. This passage is telling us that it honors God and prepares a way for God to move into a person's life so we can experience the full blessing of God, the fullness of God, not just financially, but spiritually in everything that we do. When you study this passage is landing in a place like we've talked about for the last few weeks. Ultimately, it's not about God having our money, it's about God having our heart. More than I want Church Story to have your money, I want God to have your heart. Because for where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. What is it that has your heart? Well, just look at where you're spending the most time, energy, and emotion and resources. That most likely is going to tell you what's most important to you. You know, it's funny. I love playing fantasy football, and a lot of the guys here at Church Story also love fantasy football. Ladies, if you don't play fantasy football, you probably know a guy who does. Maybe you're married to him, or it's a family member. One of the things that's interesting about fantasy football is all of a sudden you'll find yourself watching football games that you could care less about the outcome of. I will sit and watch the New England Patriots play football, even though I know they're a fraudulent franchise who like to cheat. I will sit there and watch because I have one player on my fantasy team roster that I need to excel so I can beat Birdie Nets in fantasy football every year. And so I'm emotionally invested because I've invested some money into this, because there's a prize at the end if your team does well. Why is that? Because for where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. I've sent my treasure ahead, and my heart is catching up. We consider giving and being generous into what God has called us to. We're putting our treasure ahead, desiring that our heart will catch up, that it'll be connected to the things that God has called us to. That's what the next chapter is. It's an opportunity for us to put our treasure where we want our heart to be. And when we do that, there's blessing involved. God is involved. He does something in us. We move into the fullness of life that he has for us. We don't just earn salvation. We move into something bigger. Our giving, your generosity, sacrifice, it writes you into God's story. It writes Church Story into God's story, but also writes us individually into God's story. And that's always a greater story than anything we could write on our own. This is what it looks like to live generously. Last week I touched on this, but I said I would go back to it this week, and I talked about tithing specifically. And you know, when it comes to tithing, there's some interesting dialogue and conversation around the practice of tithing. Malachi chapter 3, verse 10 says, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse so that there may be food in my house, and put me to test now in this, says the Lord of armies. If I do not open up for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you a blessing until it overflows." That's kind of an uncomfortable passage because it's saying bring in the whole tithe, bring in 10% of your income into the storehouse. What is the storehouse? It's the place where I find food. It's the place where I am fed. I consider the church a place like that. The church is a place where I grow spiritually. I'm fed spiritually. I'm understanding scripture. I'm finding community. I'm fed from the storehouse. It's saying bring the tithe to the storehouse and then test me in this. And then watch what he's going to do on the back side of that. There's blessing on the other side of it. I talked about it a little bit last week. If you weren't here, you need to go back and listen because I don't have time to unpack the whole prosperity gospel thing. I don't want you to hear me saying, give your money and you'll have more money. That's not the message here. But here's where the big debate is. This is the debate. People will often say, so are we still required as Christ followers to tithe, to give 10% to the storehouse? What's interesting is you go and you start to read into the New Testament, there is no clear precedent in the New Testament for tithing. Now, hang with me. Some of you are already arguing with me in your head. Just hang with me. You're like, Wes, we're supposed to give today, and you're telling us not to tithe. Just hang on. The tithe comes from the Old Testament law. It comes from Levitical law. It's a tenth of the harvest. And what has happened in our day is it's become a commonplace tradition for people to give 10% to the storehouse, to God, back to what God has called us to. But when you look at the New Testament redefines the idea of tithing. When you go back, and again, we don't have a ton of time, but you begin to look at some of the conversations that Jesus had with some of the religious elite, the Pharisees, who were so proud of the tithe, how they would give 10%. And Jesus calls them out one day. And he says, you're so meticulous about bringing the tithe, and you feel so good about the tithe, but as you look around, you see the widows and those who can't take care of themselves, and you're doing nothing to be generous to serve them like Jesus would serve them, which I think leads us somewhere. Let's not get stuck on a percentage that we miss out on where God is leading us to be generous to impact the lives of other people. Because if we're focused on a percentage, then we become focused on a practice, and it becomes legalism. It becomes a religious act that we're just due to kind of puff ourselves up. When I look at the New Testament, if you study the Israelites in this day, in Jesus' day, you'll actually find that they gave a lot more than 10%. Oftentimes they gave 20, 30% because they would bring the tithe to the storehouse, but then they would also give to initiatives around the community to serve and to care for people. So when I think about the tithe, I don't think about the tithe as the ceiling. I think about the tithe as the floor. It's the least that I can give. And God's called me to trust him with everything. I know what some of you are thinking, like, well, but I got to save for this house, and I got to save for retirement. And that is 100, scripture talks about saving. You can't read the Proverbs without knowing that there is something God honoring in saving and even building from your wealth, but not allowing it to become everything. When you think about this and you read through scripture, when it talks about giving, there's something that happens in us. There's a blessing. There's something that happens in our own lives as we trust him with everything. And I believe that God is calling some of us to step into that in ways that we maybe never have. That we would bring an offering out of obedience to God, to what he's led us to, giving thanks to him for what he's provided us. And as we do that, it writes us into the story of God. I've been reflecting back a lot the last several weeks, and I've talked about that some, but I go back all the way to when I was in high school. In the fall of 1997, I was in my senior year of high school, and through a series of different events and functions, it just became really clear to me that I wanted to step into full-time ministry. And honestly, what I thought that was going to look like is I was going to be a youth pastor until the day that I died. Like I was going to be the oldest living youth pastor with a cane, walking around and just loving on teenagers and just helping point them to Jesus. Like that's what I always wanted to do. And I grew up in a small town, went to a small church, and so that's what I always imagined life in ministry would be like. I love telling people what my class rank was without telling them how big my class was, because it makes me sound really smart, but I'm really not that smart. I'm just an ordinary kid from a small West Texas town who loves Jesus and wanted to point other people to Jesus. But then as I began to kind of move forward in that, pursuing ministry, I went to school, went to college, met my wife, Brandy, at A&M, and as we began to get to know each other, we not quickly, because it took her a little bit longer to figure this out than it did me, but I knew we were going to be together for a really long time. And she finally woke up to God's calling on her life. And I'm joking a little bit. But as we finally began to kind of talk about, we were dating, we started talking about life together forever and just talking about ministry. She loved student ministry. She loved serving teenagers. And I remember her saying, hey, I love being a student pastor, or love being a part of a student pastor or student ministry, but I never want to be a pastor's wife. It's funny you say that now, because surprise, she's a pastor's wife. But I remember her saying that day, there's no way. I remember sitting on a porch at this little house in Jacksboro, Texas, where I was going to be a summer intern, and Brandy bawling. She was so sad because she knew that we were going to end up moving to Jacksboro, Texas, and spending time there in ministry, that God was going to lead us there. And fortunately, she stuck around. She didn't bail on me there, but God has led us on this incredible journey that we never would have pictured for ourselves. And we began to serve on different church staffs, a few different churches over the years. And then in 2022, decided, you know what, I'm going to resign from a position I had in ministry, and I don't know what I'm going to do after that. Didn't have a plan, didn't have a job. I've shared that story. Over the next several weeks, just really began to pray and trying to look for clarity. And I was sitting down with a counselor one day, and he just said, hey, Wes, why don't you start a church? You should start a church. I was like, man, other people are telling me the same thing. Brandy's telling me to maybe start a church. And he goes, I really think you should. I think I think this is right for you. So I went home and told Brandy. I was like, she said, hey, how did your session go? And I said, well, he told me we need to start a church. She's like, I've been telling you that for the last several days, and you didn't even have to pay me to tell you that. And so I was like, I know, I'm stubborn, I'm slow, but we'll figure it out. So we didn't have a name, we didn't have a place to meet, we didn't have a website, we didn't have a bank account, we didn't have anything, but we gathered with a handful of people, some close friends of ours, because we love this community, and we love the people of this community, and we just said, God, we're believing that you want to do something, and so we're going to trust you with this. We just all together started praying about what this could be, and we quickly came up with a name called Church Story. And over the next several months, and even over the last few years, it's been miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. I remember going to some other pastors in the community when we decided to start a church, and honestly was a little bit nervous, but I was looking to them for some wisdom and just encouragement and advice on church planting. And I was nervous that they would be like, man, we don't need another church in this area, or that, they would tell me I wasn't ready, and I didn't feel like I was, but they began to just kind of encourage and share wisdom and cheer me on and ask how they could help. I remember going to lunch with one pastor in the community, and he set up the lunch because he wanted to talk to me about potentially coming on staff at their church, and then asked me to come preach there one weekend. I was like, man, I'm really honored you would even ask to have that conversation with me, but I think we're going to actually start a church. And now looking back, I'm thinking to myself, I know it would have been a lot easier to just join their staff, but we felt confident that God was leading us to do this. And then he supported it. He said, hey, how can we help? Do you need money? Do you need volunteers? What do you need? How can we assist? And I was so encouraged that all the churches in the area were saying, hey, do this. This is awesome. We're going to cheer you on. We want to support this. And we just watched God continue to work. And this week I was going back, and if you've been in my office, you've been at my house, you've maybe seen a stack of journals like this that are right behind my desk. And I've journaled my whole life. My pastor growing up told me that this was something that would be really valuable to do in my faith and just in growing up. And so if you were to look into this, you'd be like, wow, I don't know that I need this guy to be my pastor, because he can't write complete sentences. His grammar is terrible, because it's really for me. There's sermon notes in here. There's prayers that I've written out. Some of you are in those prayers. But there's also answers to prayers where I've seen God work. I've seen God do miracles, how he's provided a building for us when we didn't have a building in the very beginning, how different conversations led to opportunities for us to serve as a church and together to find community as we served our community. And then I come across in here stories of individual people who, there's a story of a man who sent me a text one day, and he was a man who's in his 80s, and he was telling me for the very first time he felt like God finally made a purpose clear to him with his life. 80 years old. Just story after story after story after story. And one of those stories is a story about a man named Jeff Greenberg and his wife Karen. And it's an incredible story. And instead of me sharing the story with you, I want Jeff and Karen to share the story with you.
When Jeff and I met, we kind of had to make a journey together.
I don't recall that Karen and I ever really spoke about religion with each other much, so it's an interesting thing to think about. I never really felt like I needed church. I didn't really have a desire to go. I just always felt like I could just get what I needed, either when I was fishing or hunting or doing whatever I was doing in nature, that I always felt close to nature. But I don't think that I really understood really the importance of being part of something like a church until Church Story.
I had been attending some Bible studies, and I was afraid of approaching Jeff as far as going to church and ruining our weekend rituals we have, getting up in the morning, sitting outside, enjoying that. But I think on the other hand, he knew that I was anxious to be doing more, getting more. One of the women in my Bible study group invited us, and we tried, and it just didn't quite jive. We kind of had a little bit better idea of what we were expecting from a church after the first two visits to the other church. Had a lot of anticipation, a lot of expectation. And then another person invited us from Church Story.
We should say her name because we'll be we're thankful. It's Anna Kastner, and we'll be forever grateful for her inviting us
So blessed.
to Church
Yes, yes. When we walked through the doors, there were people there right away and welcoming and smiling, and it just felt a lot of togetherness.
And also while we were in the lobby, after experiencing the conversations and the warmth and the happy feelings, we could hear the music in the cafeteria, right? It was like amazing, and we couldn't wait to get in because we just love music. So we sat with Anna and some others, and they had their spot on the fourth row where they sit. Now we've moved up to the first or second row, which I'm proud of. But anyway, the music was just amazing, and the time that you took in the beginning to welcome the newcomers, again, that felt absolutely good and real, and made us feel so welcome and glad that we came, and we were like, man, this is the place. I mean, there are like real people here doing a real thing, and it was amazing.
I'd been praying a long time for God to soften Jeff's heart. When we were at Church Story and the band sang, I looked over at Jeff, and he had some tears in his eyes, and he felt like Christ had entered his heart, and that was amazing to me.
Jesus had been after me for a long time, and I wasn't listening. That was when it happened, and I could feel Jesus inside of me, and it was amazing.
It was like, now I know what it means that God can move mountains. And just seeing Jeff dive in, joining a team at church, and dedicating himself to reading the Bible every day, I mean, fills my heart.
We talked about membership, and I think it was you that said, well, you have to be baptized to be a member. I'm sure that I had a very weird look on my face, like, oh, really? I'm probably not going to do that, is what I thought.
In the Catholic Church, been baptized as an infant, and I never thought I would go through baptism as an adult. When you make your own decision, your own conscious decision to do that in front of other people, and then to be able to do it with Jeff, being with everybody at Church Story, and all the people that are happy for you and they don't even know.
So when I was 14, I had gone hunting 6 or 8 hours away from home by car. I had a hunting accident. When my mom and dad got divorced, I lived with my mom, so it was really the two of us, and she worked full time, so she would travel occasionally. And I was in the hospital for probably a year. During that time, she found Jesus, and she was one of the most spiritual people that I ever met, though she passed away about 3 years ago, so that we never got to experience that together. Even during the baptism, there were couple of people that we're close to, and I voiced this, and they said she knows.
It doesn't matter how old you are or how lost you are. God will find you. Will help you.
Church story has changed my life in a good way.
That's God for you.
Yeah.
It's an incredible story. And I know it's an incredible story because I've had a front row seat to it over the last several months, and just watching Jeff and Karen continue to step into what God has called them to. They are sitting on the front row this morning. And I am incredibly proud of you, but also thankful that you didn't just step in with Jesus, but you've stepped in to point other people to Jesus. And that's what this is all about. That's the mandate for us. That's the mission. I asked Jeff if I could share this morning. When he first showed up the very first time, um, Jeff grew up in a very rigid, legalistic, kind of religious tradition. And because of that, there were a couple things that always really bothered him. And one of those was the big, extravagant buildings that churches will build and spend money on things that seem unnecessary and over the top. And that's just something that bothered him. And he would tell you that there was probably some baggage there from growing up in that tradition in a single parent home, but also the rigid expectation and requirement to tithe 10% and to make sure that was being given just had left a bad taste in his mouth when it came to anything attached to faith. And so when he showed up to church story, he told me the week after that his two favorite things were, when he showed up, it was a school. There was nothing extravagant about it as far as church goes. It was just a school building, and he loved that about it. But he also loved that there were no offering plates passed, and he couldn't believe it. He's like, I don't understand that. I don't know. That's crazy to me, but that's significant. And that was something we decided in day one. I talked about that last week. We didn't want that to become a wall for anyone to just show up and just hear the good news of Jesus. So it was very intentional, but to hear that both those things were really valuable to him was confirming, I think, affirming of what God had led us to. What's funny is the next week, or a couple weeks later, they came to the welcome dinner, and we talked about church membership, but we talked about a new building and a new church home one day. And Jeff was bummed because he wanted to be in the school forever. And I can confidently say he no longer feels that way because he's been on the logistics team for the last several months. And so he helps set up and tear down on a regular basis. And he looks forward to a place that we can call home that's not extravagant for the sake of being extravagant, but is a place where people can meet Jesus and find purpose and belonging and healing.